The morning sun cast long shadows across the dusty streets of New Terra Colony. The settlement sprawled across the red soil like a metal and concrete rash, its buildings rising from the planet's surface in neat rows. 200 years had passed since humans first left Earth, and places like this had become their new home among the stars. Jake Morrison walked down the main street with his two friends, Danny and Pete. At 16, Jake was tall for his age, with sandy brown hair and the kind of confident swagger that came from knowing his father owned half the colony. Richard Morrison's mining company had built this place, and everyone knew it. "My dad's buying another transport ship next month," Jake said, kicking a small rock down the street. "Maybe I'll get to fly it," Danny laughed. "You can't even drive the ground vehicles without crashing them." "That was one time," Jake shot back, though his grin suggested he wasn't really upset. "Besides, who's going to stop me? My dad practically runs this place." The three boys continued walking toward the lower district, where the colony's older residents and less wealthy families lived. The buildings here were smaller, older, and showed more wear from the planet's harsh winds. Jake liked coming here. Sometimes it made him feel important to see how the other half lived. As they rounded a corner near the community center, they saw an elderly woman sitting on a bench outside. Margaret Bell was in her 70s, with gray hair pulled back in a simple bun and clothes that had been mended several times. Beside her sat a medium-sized dog with golden fur and intelligent brown eyes. The animal wore a special harness that marked it as a service dog. The dog's name was Luna, though the boys didn't know that. What they could see was that Margaret relied on the animal to help her walk. Her cane leaned against the bench beside her, and Luna sat alert and ready to assist if needed. "Look at that old lady," Pete whispered. "My mom says she used to be married to some war hero or something." Jake barely heard him. His attention was focused on the dog. For reasons he couldn't quite explain, the sight of the calm, well-trained animal irritated him. Maybe it was the way Luna sat so perfectly still, so obedient and useful. Maybe it was how the old woman clearly depended on something Jake saw as just a dumb beast. Margaret noticed the boys approaching and smiled warmly. "Good morning," she called out. "Beautiful day, isn't it?" Luna's tail wagged slightly at the sound of voices. The dog had been trained to be friendly with people, to make connections that would help Margaret feel less isolated in her old age. When Luna saw the three young men, her training kicked in. She stood up and walked a few steps toward them, her tail still wagging in greeting. "Hey there, girl," Danny said, reaching out to pet Luna's head. The dog accepted the attention happily, but Jake stepped back, his face twisting with disgust. "Get that thing away from me," he said loudly. "I don't want some dirty animal touching me." Margaret's smile faded. "Oh, I'm sorry. Luna's very clean, and she's just being friendly. She won't hurt you." "I don't care what it won't do," Jake snapped. "Keep your mutt under control." Luna, sensing the tension in Jake's voice, backed away. Slightly, but her training told her to remain calm and friendly. She sat down a few feet from the boys, her head tilted slightly as if trying to understand why this human seemed angry. Jake's irritation grew. The dog's patient, innocent expression made something ugly twist in his chest. Here was this stupid animal, taking up space, being useless except to help some old woman who probably should have been in a care facility anyway. And everyone was supposed to think it was wonderful and special just because it wore a little harness. "Jake, come on," Pete said quietly. "Let's just go." But Jake wasn't listening. The feeling in his chest was getting stronger, a hot anger that demanded action. He looked at Luna sitting there so calmly, so trusting, and something in him snapped without warning. Jake stepped forward and kicked Luna hard in her side. The dog yelped in pain and surprise, stumbling sideways before limping quickly back to Margaret's side. Luna pressed against the old woman's legs, trembling and whimpering softly. "Luna!" Margaret cried out, reaching down to check her companion. Her hands shook as she felt along the dog's ribs, looking for injuries. "What did you do? Why would you hurt her?" Jake felt a rush of satisfaction at the shock and fear in the old woman's voice. "Maybe now you'll keep that thing away from people who don't want to be bothered," he said. Danny and Pete stood frozen, staring at their friend. They had seen Jake be mean before, but this was different. This was cruel in a way that made them uncomfortable. "Dude, that's not cool," Danny said quietly. Jake turned on him with a sneer. "What, are you going to tell my dad? Go ahead. See how far that gets you." Margaret was crying now, soft tears running down her weathered cheeks as she tried to comfort Luna. The dog was still trembling, pressing close to her owner for safety. "She never hurt anyone," Margaret whispered. "She's a good dog. She helps me." "Then maybe you should take better care of your property," Jake said coldly. The word property came out with particular venom, as if the idea that anyone could love an animal was personally offensive to him. What Jake didn't notice was the man standing in the shadows of the alley across the street. John Constantine had been walking through the lower district, getting familiar with the colony layout as he always did when he arrived somewhere new. He was tall and lean, with dark hair starting to show gray at the temples, and the kind of quiet presence that made people forget he was there. John had seen the entire incident. He watched Jake kick the dog, saw the cruelty in the boy's face, heard the callous words that followed. Most importantly, he saw how Jake's friends had reacted with disgust, and how Jake had used his father's power to silence any objection. John had been drifting from colony to colony for 5 years now, taking odd jobs and keeping to himself. He had his reasons for staying out of sight, for avoiding attention. But as he watched the old woman cry over her injured dog while a privileged teenager walked away laughing, John felt something stir in him that he hadn't felt in a long time. Margaret managed to help Luna stand up. The dog was limping badly on her left side, but she gamely tried to support her owner as they made their slow way toward the medical center. Every step clearly caused Luna pain, but she never stopped trying to do her job. John stepped out of the shadows and crossed the street. John crossed the street with quiet steps. Margaret was still trying to help Luna walk, both of them moving slowly toward the medical center. The old woman's face was wet with tears, and she kept whispering gentle words to her injured companion. "Ma'am," John said softly, not wanting to startle her. "Can I help you?" Margaret looked up at him with red eyes. She saw a man in simple clothes, maybe in his 40s, with kind eyes and calloused hands. "I don't know," she said. "Luna is hurt. That boy kicked her for no reason." John knelt down beside the dog. Luna looked at him with wary eyes, but she didn't try to move away. John had a way with animals. His hands were gentle as he checked Luna's side where Jake had kicked her. "She's going to be okay," John said after a moment. "But she needs to see the vet. Here, let me help you both get there." John carefully lifted Luna in his arms. The dog was heavy, but he carried her easily. Margaret walked beside him, leaning on her cane. They made their way to the small veterinary clinic 3 blocks away. Dr. Amy Price was the colony's only vet. She was a young woman with short red hair and a no-nonsense attitude. When she saw John carrying the injured dog, she immediately cleared a space on her examination table. "What happened?" Dr. Price asked as she began checking Luna over. "A boy kicked her," Margaret said, her voice shaking. "Jake Morrison. He just walked up and kicked her for no reason." Dr. Price's hand stopped moving for a moment. John noticed the pause. "Jake Morrison did this?" the vet asked. "You know him?" John asked quietly. Dr. Price continued her examination without looking up. "Everyone knows Jake Morrison, and everyone knows better than to cause trouble with his family." John watched the vet work while Margaret sat in a chair nearby. Luna would need pain medication and rest, but no bones were broken. The kick had been Hard enough to cause serious bruising, but the dog would recover. She'd be fine in a week or two, Dr. Price told Margaret. But she shouldn't do any heavy work for a while. No helping you walk until she heals. Margaret nodded, though John could see she was worried. Without Luna's help, getting around the colony would be much harder for her. After they left the clinic, John walked Margaret home. Her small apartment was in one of the older buildings, neat but showing its age. John helped her get Luna settled on a soft blanket near the window. "Thank you for helping us," Margaret said. "I don't know what I would have done without you." "What's your name?" John asked. "Margaret Bell. And you are?" "John Constantine," he said. It wasn't his real name, but it was the name he had been using for the past 5 years. "I'm new to the colony." Margaret made them both tea while Luna rested. As they sat at her small kitchen table, John asked careful questions about Jake Morrison. "He's been getting worse," Margaret said sadly. "His father owns Morrison Mining Company. They control most of the work here. Jake thinks that means he can do whatever he wants." "Has he hurt other people?" John asked. Margaret was quiet for a long moment, then she nodded. "Last month, he broke the windows on Mrs. Chun's apartment. She's 85 and lives on a fixed pension. She couldn't afford to replace them, so she had to cover them with plastic sheeting." John listened without speaking. 2 weeks ago, he and his friends destroyed the community garden that some of the families had been working on for months. They said it was just a prank, but people had been growing food there to help with expenses. What did the security forces do? Margaret laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Security works for Morrison Mining. They told Mrs. Chun that there was no proof Jake broke her windows. They said the garden was destroyed by wild animals." John spent the next 3 days learning about the colony. He took a job doing maintenance. Work for the transportation depot, which gave him a reason to move around different parts of the settlement. He listened to conversations and asked casual questions. What he learned made him angry. Jake Morrison wasn't just a spoiled teenager acting out. He was systematically targeting the weakest members of the colony. The elderly, the poor, families with no connections to the mining company. And he was getting bolder. Mrs. Cheen told John about her broken windows, but also about how Jake had accidentally bumped into her at the market, making her drop her groceries. When she complained, Jake had laughed and said maybe she should be more careful. A man named Frank Rodriguez described how Jake had loosened the bolts on his maintenance cart, causing it to fall apart while Frank was working. Frank had nearly been crushed by falling equipment, but security ruled it an accident. A young mother named Lisa Parker said Jake had been harassing her 10-year-old son Billy on the way to school. Nothing physical yet, but threats and intimidation that left the boy afraid to leave their apartment. The pattern was clear. Jake enjoyed hurting people who couldn't fight back, and his father's money and power protected him from any consequences. On his 4th day in the colony, John decided to observe Jake directly. He found the teenager hanging out with his friends near the Central Plaza, talking loudly about his father's latest business deals. "Dad's thinking about expanding into the next sector," Jake was saying. "Might mean some of the older families. Here we'll have to relocate." "Where would they go?" Danny asked. Jake shrugged. "Not my problem. Maybe they should have thought about that before they got old and useless." John watched from a distance as Jake spent the afternoon looking for targets. The boy seemed to have a talent for spotting vulnerability. When he saw an elderly man struggling with heavy packages, Jake deliberately walked close enough to bump into him, making the man drop everything. "Watch where you're going, old man," Jake said loudly, then walked away, laughing while the man struggled to pick up his scattered belongings. John helped the man gather his packages after Jake left. The old man thanked him, but wouldn't give his name. John could see the fear in his eyes. That evening, John returned to check on Margaret and Luna. The dog was feeling better, able to walk around the apartment, though she was still moving carefully. "How is she doing?" John asked, scratching Luna behind the ears. "Better," Margaret said. "Dr. Price says she'll be back to normal soon. But I've been thinking about what happened. About Jake." John looked at her. "What about him?" Margaret was quiet. For a moment, looking at old photographs on her mantelpiece. John noticed several pictures of a man in military uniform. "My husband served in the Centauri Wars," Margaret said finally. "He used to say that the worst enemies weren't the aliens they fought. The worst enemies were the humans who forgot what they were supposed to be protecting." John studied the photographs more carefully. The uniform looked familiar. He said there were some soldiers, special ones, whose job was to make sure humanity didn't lose its soul while conquering the stars. He called them the Keepers. John went very still. He said they made sure that even in the darkest places, even when no one was watching, humans remembered how to be human. Margaret turned to look at John. "I think Jake Morrison has forgotten how to be human, and I think someone needs to remind him." John met her eyes. "What was your husband's name?" "Captain Robert Bell, Terran Defense Corps, 3rd Fleet." John closed his eyes for a moment. When he opened them, Margaret was watching him carefully. "You knew him," she said. It wasn't a question. John nodded slowly. "He was a good man. A good officer. Then you know what he would want someone to do about Jake Morrison." John looked at Luna, who was resting peacefully on her blanket. The dog trusted humans completely, even after being hurt by one. That trust was something worth protecting. "Yes," John said quietly. "I know exactly what you want." John spent the next week watching Jake Morrison more carefully. What he discovered made his blood run cold. Jake's cruelty wasn't random. It wasn't just teenage rebellion or showing off for his friends. There was a pattern to it, a method that suggested something much darker. Jake was hunting. Every morning, Jake would walk through different parts of the colony. He seemed to be studying people, looking for weaknesses. He watched how they moved, who they talked to, where they lived. He was building a mental map of every vulnerable person in the settlement. John followed at a distance, staying in shadows and keeping quiet. His years of military training made him good at not being seen. Jake never noticed him. On Tuesday, John watched Jake spend 20 minutes observing Mrs. Chin as she did her shopping. The old woman moved slowly, counting her money carefully before buying anything. Jake took notes on a small device, recording what time she shopped and which route she took home. On Wednesday, Jake followed Frank Rodriguez to the water treatment plant where Frank worked. Jake spent an hour studying the facility, paying special attention to the safety equipment and emergency protocols. He asked Frank's supervisor questions about the systems, pretending to be interested in a school project. On Thursday, Jake visited the residential sector where many elderly colonists lived. He walked through the hallways, checking door locks and security cameras. He chatted with maintenance workers, asking about building systems and emergency procedures. John realized with growing horror that Jake was planning something big. The boy wasn't just looking for people to bully. He was studying the colony's infrastructure, looking for ways to cause maximum damage. That evening, John broke into the Colonial Administration building. His military training included skills that weren't exactly legal, but sometimes necessary. He needed to see the colony's technical systems. What he found in the computer files confirmed his worst fears. Someone had been accessing blueprints for the atmospheric recycling systems, the same systems that kept the air breathable in the residential sectors. The access codes belonged to a student account registered to Jake Morrison. John studied the blueprints carefully. The atmospheric system was old, but reliable. It had several safety backups, but if someone knew exactly where to cause damage, they could make the air dangerous for people with breathing problems. The elderly residents in Margaret's building would be the most at risk. John copied the files and left the building as quietly as he had entered. Back in his small rented room, he spent hours studying the atmospheric system. He found 3 critical points where sabotage could cause serious problems. If someone damaged all 3 at the same time, the building's air supply would become toxic within hours. The next morning, John went to check on Margaret and Luna. The dog was much better, able to walk without limping. She greeted John with a wagging tail and seemed happy to see him. "She's almost back to normal," Margaret said, smiling as she watched Luna play with a toy. "Dr. Price says she can start helping me walk again in a few days." John was glad Luna was recovering, but he was worried about something much more serious. He needed to know more about the building's systems without alarming Margaret. "This is a nice building," John said casually. "How old is it?" "About 15 years, Margaret replied. "It was one of the first residential buildings they built here. The air recycling system has been acting up lately, though. Makes funny noises at night." John's heart sank. The building was old enough to have the vulnerable system design he had seen in the blueprints. "What kind of noises?" he asked. "Clicking sounds, like something is loose. The maintenance man came to look at it last week, but he said everything was fine." John excused himself and went to examine the building's mechanical systems. He found the atmospheric recycling equipment in the basement. Sure enough, someone had been tampering with it. Bolts had been loosened and then tightened again. Wires had been moved. Nothing was broken yet, but it was clear someone had been preparing for sabotage. John spent the rest of the day quietly fixing the damage he found. He tightened bolts, secured wires, and added some extra safety measures. But he knew that if Jake was really planning to attack the building, he would try again. That afternoon, John positioned himself where he could watch the building entrance. He didn't have to wait long. Jake arrived at 4 o'clock, carrying a backpack and wearing work clothes. He looked around carefully, then used a key card to enter the building. John realized that Jake must have stolen or copied a maintenance worker's access card. John waited 5 minutes, then followed Jake into the building. He moved silently through the corridors, tracking Jake by sound. He could hear the boy working in the basement, doing something to the mechanical systems. From the stairwell, John could see Jake in the equipment room. The teenager had tools spread out around him and was working on the main atmospheric control unit. He was installing something small and electronic on the system's main circuit board. John recognized the device. It was a remote-controlled override switch. With that installed, Jake could shut down the building's air recycling system from anywhere in the colony using a simple transmitter. Jake finished his work and packed up his tools. He left the building through a side entrance, looking pleased with himself. John waited until Jake was gone, then went to examine what the boy had done. The override device was professionally installed and well hidden. Jake had clearly planned this for weeks, maybe months. John carefully removed the device without damaging the system. But he left the mounting brackets in place, so Jake wouldn't immediately know his sabotage had been discovered. Over the next 2 days, John found similar devices in 2 other buildings in the residential sector. Jake had been busy. He was preparing to attack multiple buildings at once, putting hundreds of elderly and vulnerable colonists at risk. John realized he was dealing with something much more serious than teenage cruelty. Jake Morrison was planning what could only be called a terrorist attack against his own community. The question was why. John decided he needed to understand Jake's motivation. He began following the boy more closely, listening to his conversations with friends and family. What he learned made him sick. Jake wasn't just cruel, he was genuinely disturbed. He talked about the elderly residents like they were insects, referring to them as dead weight and waste of resources. He complained that his father's mining company had to provide services to people who didn't contribute anything to the colony's economy. This place would be so much better without all the useless old people, Jake told his friend Danny during lunch. They just sit around using up air and food and medical supplies. That's kind of harsh, Danny replied, looking uncomfortable. It's realistic, Jake said. My dad says that in the old days, people who couldn't work didn't eat. Maybe it's time to go back to that system. John realized that Jake had convinced himself that murdering elderly colonists would be some kind of public service. The boy's sense of entitlement had grown into something monstrous. That evening, John visited Margaret again. Luna was fully recovered now, back to helping her owner walk and providing companionship. The dog seemed to sense John's troubled mood and came to sit beside him. You look worried, Margaret said. Is everything okay? John looked at this kind old woman and her faithful companion. He thought about all the other elderly residents in the building, people who had worked hard there, whole lives and deserved to live out their final years in peace and safety. Margaret, John said carefully, if something dangerous was going to happen to people in this building, would you want to know about it? Margaret studied his face. What kind of danger? John was quiet for a moment. He couldn't tell her the whole truth without causing panic, but he needed to prepare her. The kind where people might need to leave quickly, he said. Margaret nodded slowly. My husband always said that the most dangerous enemy was the one who convinced himself that cruelty was kindness. She looked at the photographs of her husband on the mantelpiece. He also said that when good people do nothing, evil people think they have permission to do anything. Margaret turned back to John. Whatever is coming, we'll face it. But we won't run away and leave our neighbors to face it alone. John felt a familiar stirring in his chest. It was the same feeling he had experienced years ago when he took an oath to protect humanity's innocent and vulnerable. An oath he had never formally abandoned. Then we need to be ready, John said quietly. Outside, storm clouds were gathering over New Terra Colony. Jake Morrison was getting angry. Someone had been interfering with his plans. He had returned to check on his work in the residential buildings, only to find that his carefully installed override devices were gone, all of them. Someone had discovered his sabotage and removed every single piece of equipment. Jake sat in his bedroom, staring at the remote control transmitter that was now useless. Months of planning had been ruined. Worse, someone out there knew what he had been trying to do. He thought about the past few weeks. Had anyone been watching him? Had he made a mistake somewhere? Then he remembered the man who had helped the old woman with her stupid dog. The stranger who had appeared right after Jake had kicked the animal. Jake had seen him around the colony several times since then, always in different places, always seeming to mind his own business. But maybe he hadn't been minding his own business at all. Jake picked up his communication device and called his friend Danny. I need you to find out about someone, Jake said when Danny answered. There's a guy, maybe 40 years old, dark hair going gray. He's been hanging around the colony for about 2 weeks. What about him? Danny asked. I think he's the one who's been messing with my stuff. I want to know who he is and what he's doing here. Danny was quiet for a moment. Jake, maybe you should just let this go. What you were planning to do to those buildings, that was seriously messed up. Jake's voice turned cold. Are you going to help me or not? Danny sighed. I'll ask around. But Jake, I don't want to be part of whatever you're planning to do to this guy. You don't have to be part of anything. Just find out who he is. After Danny hung up, Jake sat back in his chair and thought. Whoever this stranger was, he had made a big mistake by interfering with Jake Morrison. Nobody crossed the Morrison family without consequences. Meanwhile, John was making preparations of his own. He had spent 3 days watching Jake's reaction to the discovery of his sabotage. The boy was angry and frustrated, but John could see that Jake was also planning something new. John had learned to read people during his military years. Jake had the look of someone who was setting a trap. John wasn't surprised when Jake made his move. It started with a message that someone slipped under Margaret's door. The note was written in block letters and said, "Your dog will pay for what your friend did. Meet me at the old mining tunnels at sunset if you want to save her." Margaret found the note when she came home from shopping. Luna was with her, healthy and happy after her recovery. Margaret read the note twice, then immediately called John. "He has Luna," Margaret said when John arrived at her apartment. John looked around the small space. "Where is she?" "I don't know. When I got home, she was gone," and this note was on the floor. John read the message. It was obviously from Jake, and it was obviously a trap. The boy was using Luna to draw John into a confrontation on ground of Jake's choosing. "The old mining tunnels are outside the colony," Margaret said. "They're dangerous. Some of them collapsed years ago." John nodded. He had seen the abandoned mining site on his walks around the colony. It was isolated, full of hiding places and far from any help. Perfect for an ambush. "You can't go," Margaret said. "It's what he wants." "I know," John replied. "But he has Luna." Margaret grabbed John's arm. "She's just a dog." John looked at her steadily. "No, she's not. She's your partner. She's your friend. She trusts humans to protect her, and we failed her once already." John gently removed Margaret's hand from his arm. "Besides, this isn't really about Luna. Jake is escalating. If I don't stop him now, he'll try something worse next time. Then call security. Call the authorities. Security works for his father. The authorities won't act without proof, and by the time I get proof, Luna could be dead." John walked to the window and looked out at the colony. The sun was getting lower in the sky. Sunset was in 2 hours. "There's something I need to tell you about your husband," John said without turning around. Margaret waited. "He was more than just my commanding officer. He was the one who recruited me for special training. There was a unit called the Keepers. We took an oath to protect innocent life, no matter where we found it." John turned back to face Margaret. "When the Centauri Wars ended, they disbanded our unit. Told us to blend in, find new lives, but the oath doesn't expire." Margaret studied John's face. "You're going to fight him." "I'm going to stop him." John went back to his room to prepare. From a locked case hidden under his bed, he retrieved items he hadn't touched in 5 years. A tactical vest that could stop most small weapons. A communications device that could call for emergency backup if needed. And a small medical kit designed for battlefield injuries. John also took something else from the case. A small metal badge with a symbol that looked like a shield with stars around it. The badge of the Keepers. He hadn't worn it since the unit was disbanded, but tonight felt like the right time. As John prepared his equipment, he thought about Jake Morrison. The boy was 16 years old, raised in wealth and privilege, with no real understanding of consequences or danger. Jake thought he was setting a trap for some interfering stranger. Jake had no idea he was about to face someone who had spent years training to protect the innocent against threats much worse than spoiled teenagers. But John wasn't looking forward to the confrontation. Jake was still young. There might be a chance to reach him, to make him understand what he was becoming before it was too late. The sun was setting as John made his way toward the old mining site. The abandoned tunnels were cut into a hillside about a mile from the colony's main buildings. Equipment and debris were scattered around the entrance, leftovers from when the site had been active. John approached carefully, using the shadows and cover to avoid being seen. His military training made him naturally cautious in unfamiliar territory. He found Luna tied to a support beam near the main tunnel entrance. The dog was unharmed but clearly frightened. When she saw John, her tail wagged hopefully. "It's okay, girl," John whispered as he moved closer. "I'm going to get you out of here." But as John reached for the rope holding Luna, he heard a voice from deeper in the tunnel. "I wouldn't do that if I were you." Jake Morrison stepped out of the shadows holding a small device in his hand. John recognized it as a remote detonator. "That's right," Jake said, seeing John's expression. There are explosives wired to this whole section. One button push and the tunnel collapses, burying you and the mutt. John stood slowly, keeping his hands visible. Let the dog go, Jake. This is between you and me, Jake laughed. You still don't get it, do you? This isn't about the dog. This is about teaching you not to interfere with things that aren't your business. Terrorizing elderly people is everyone's business. Terrorizing? Jake's voice rose in mock surprise. I was trying to help this colony become more efficient. Get rid of the dead weight. John felt a familiar cold anger settling in his chest. It was the same feeling he had experienced years ago, when facing enemies who had convinced themselves that cruelty was justified. Dead weight, John repeated quietly. That's right. People like that old woman and her stupid dog. They consume resources without contributing anything. The colony would be better off without them. John studied Jake's face in the dim light. The boy genuinely believed what he was saying. In his mind, attempting to murder elderly colonists had been a public service. You really think that, John said. I know it. My father built this place. We decide who belongs here and who doesn't. John nodded slowly. I see. And what about people who disagree with you? Jake held up the detonator. They learn not to interfere. Behind Jake, deeper in the tunnel, John could see the shapes of explosive charges attached to the support beams. Jake had been planning this ambush for days, maybe weeks. The boy was serious about murder, but Jake had made one critical mistake. He assumed that John was just an ordinary colonist who could be intimidated or killed like any other victim. Jake. Morrison had no idea what he had actually trapped in these tunnels with him. John reached up and touched the keeper badge on his vest. After 5 years of hiding, it was time to remember who he really was. Jake, John said quietly, I'm going to give you one chance to surrender and release the dog. Jake laughed. You're not in a position to give me anything, old man. John smiled, and something in that smile made Jake take a step backward. Actually, John said, I'm in exactly the right position. Jake felt something change in the air around him. The stranger's smile wasn't friendly or scared. It was the kind of smile that predators wore when they stopped pretending to be prey. What's so funny? Jake demanded, trying to keep his voice steady. John took a step forward. It was a small movement, but something about it made Jake instinctively back away. You want to know what's funny? John asked. A spoiled boy playing with explosives thinks he's dangerous. Jake held up the detonator. I am dangerous. One push of this button and we both die. No, John said calmly. One push of that button and you learn why I've been watching you for 2 weeks instead of just killing you on day 1. The words hit Jake like cold water. This man had been watching him. This man had been close enough to kill him for 2 weeks. And Jake had never even noticed. John continued walking forward with slow, steady steps. You see, Jake, I've been trying to decide if you could be saved. Trying to figure out if there was still something human left in you. Stay back, Jake warned, his finger hovering over the detonator button. John stopped moving. Tell me about the explosives, Jake. Where did you get them? That's none of your business. Wrong answer. John's voice went flat and cold. Those explosives came from your father's mining operation. You stole them from a work site. That means other people touched them, moved them, stored them. Other people's fingerprints are on the containers. Jake's eyes widened slightly. He hadn't thought about fingerprints. When these tunnels collapse, John continued, investigators will find traces of those explosives. They'll trace them back to the mining company. Your father will be the first suspect in a double murder. My father can handle any investigation, Jake said, but his voice was less confident now. Can he handle a Terran Defense Corps investigation? Jake went very still. What? John reached into his vest and pulled out his keeper badge. Even in the dim light of the tunnel, the metal caught the fading sunlight from outside. "My name isn't John Constantine," he said quietly. "It's Commander John Hayes, Terran Defense Corps, Special Operations. Unit designation, Keeper 7. Jake stared at the badge. Everyone in the colonies knew about the Terran Defense Corps. They were the military force that had won the Centauri Wars, and the Keepers were legendary. Elite soldiers trained to protect human civilians and maintain order in the outer colonies. "You're lying," Jake whispered. "Am I?" John asked. "How do you think I found your sabotage devices so quickly? How do you think I knew exactly where to look for them?" Jake's hand was shaking now. The detonator felt heavy in his grip. "The Keepers were disbanded," Jake said. "The unit was disbanded." "The oath wasn't." John took another step forward. "And my oath says that I protect innocent life from threats. Even when those threats are 16-year-old boys who think murder is a game." Jake pressed the detonator button. Nothing happened. John smiled again, and this time Jake understood why that smile was so terrifying. "Did you really think I would walk into your trap without disarming it first?" John asked. "I've been in these tunnels for an hour, Jake. I found your explosives, your backup explosives, and the spare detonator you hid behind that support beam." Jake looked around frantically. All his careful planning, all his preparations, had been useless against someone who actually knew what they were doing. "Here's what's going to happen," John said, his voice calm and reasonable. "You're going to untie that dog. Then you're going to sit down and listen while I explain some things to you. And if I don't?" John moved so fast that Jake didn't even see it happen. One moment John was standing 10 feet away. The next moment he was right next to Jake, and the detonator was in John's hand instead of Jake's. Jake stumbled backward, his heart pounding. He had never seen anyone move that fast. "That wasn't a request," John said, examining the detonator. "It was me being polite." Jake looked around the tunnel, searching for escape routes, but John seemed to read his mind. "There are 3 ways out of these tunnels," John said. "I'm standing in front of the main entrance. The other 2 exits are blocked by rock slides that I triggered an hour ago." Jake realized he was trapped, completely and utterly trapped. "Untie the dog, Jake." With shaking hands, Jake untied the rope holding Luna. The dog immediately ran to John, who knelt down to check her over. Luna seemed unharmed but frightened. "Good girl," John said gently, scratching behind her ears. "You're okay now." John looked up at Jake, who was standing frozen against the tunnel wall. "Sit down," John commanded. Jake sat. John remained kneeling beside Luna, but his attention was focused entirely on Jake. "Do you know what the worst part of the Centauri Wars was?" Jake shook his head. "It wasn't fighting the aliens. They were just defending their territory. The worst part was fighting the humans who had forgotten what they were supposed to be." John stood up slowly. There were humans who decided that being strong meant hurting the weak. Humans who thought that being successful meant stepping on others. Humans who convinced themselves that cruelty was just practical thinking. Jake tried to speak, but no words came out. "Those humans were more dangerous than any alien enemy," John continued, "because they looked like us. They sounded like us. But they had stopped being us." John walked closer to Jake. "Tell me, Jake, when did you stop being human?" I don't." Jake stammered. "When did you decide that an old woman and her dog deserved to suffer? When did you decide that elderly people were worth less than you? When did you decide that you had the right to choose who lived and who died?" Each question hit Jake like a physical blow. He had never thought about his actions in those terms. "I wasn't going to kill anyone," Jake protested weakly. "You sabotaged atmospheric systems in buildings full of elderly people with breathing problems. What did you think was going to happen?" Jake was silent. "You planned to collapse these tunnels with both of us inside. What did you think was going to happen?" Still, Silent. You kidnapped an innocent animal to use as bait in a murder plot. What did you think was going to happen? Jake started crying. Not the angry tears of a frustrated teenager, but the broken sobs of someone who was finally seeing himself clearly. I don't know, he whispered. I don't know what I was thinking. John knelt down in front of Jake. That's the first honest thing you've said tonight. For several minutes, the only sound in the tunnel was Jake's crying and Luna's gentle breathing. Finally, John spoke again. Here's what I think happened to you, Jake. You grew up with so much power and privilege that you forgot other people were real. You started seeing them as things instead of people. Jake nodded through his tears. And once you stop seeing people as people, hurting them becomes easy, doesn't it? Jake nodded again. But here's the thing about being human, John said. It's not something you're born with and keep forever. It's something you choose every day with every action. John stood up. You can choose to be human again, Jake, but it means giving up the power to hurt people. It means accepting that other people matter as much as you do. It means taking responsibility for the harm you've already caused. Jake looked up at John. With red, swollen eyes. How? You start by making things right with the people you've hurt. All of them. Mrs. Chun, Frank Rodriguez, Margaret Bell, everyone. And then? Then you spend the rest of your life proving that you've learned what it means to be human. John walked over to Luna and gently picked her up. But understand this, Jake. If you ever hurt another innocent person, if you ever again decide that someone else's life doesn't matter, I'll be watching. And next time, I won't be interested in teaching you lessons. Jake believed him completely. As John carried Luna toward the tunnel entrance, he paused and looked back at Jake. Your father's security team will find you here in about an hour. I called them before I came. Tell them whatever story you want about how you got trapped. But Jake, yes? Tomorrow you start making amends, or I start making other arrangements. John disappeared into the darkness outside the tunnel, leaving Jake alone with his thoughts and the weight of what he had almost become. 3 weeks later, Margaret Bell was sitting on her favorite bench outside the community center when she saw Jake Morrison walking toward her. Luna was beside Margaret, fully healed and back to her duties as a service dog. Margaret's first instinct was fear, but as Jake got closer, she could see that something was different about him. He walked slower, with his head down. His expensive clothes had been replaced with simple work clothes that were actually dirty from real work. Jake stopped a few feet away from the bench. He didn't speak right away. Mrs. Bell, Jake said finally, I wanted to apologize. Margaret studied his face. The arrogant sneer was gone. His eyes were red, as if he had been crying recently. For what? Margaret asked. For hurting Luna. For scaring you. For ... Jake's voice broke slightly. For being the kind of person who would hurt a dog just because I could. Luna looked at Jake with interest but no fear. Dogs forgave quickly, especially dogs trained to help people. I brought something, Jake said. He reached into his backpack and pulled out a small package. It's a new toy for Luna, and some treats. Margaret accepted the package but continued watching Jake's face. I also wanted to ask if there was anything I could do to help you, Jake continued. Around your apartment, or with shopping, or anything else. Why? Margaret asked. Jake was quiet for a long moment. Because I need to learn how to be a better person. And I think helping people instead of hurting them might be a good place to start. Margaret saw John Constantine approaching from across the plaza. Jake saw him too and went very still. Hello, Jake, John said calmly. How are you doing? I'm trying, Jake replied. I went to see Mrs. Chun yesterday. Fixed her windows and painted her apartment. She made me tea afterward. John nodded. And Frank Rodriguez? I helped him repair his maintenance cart. And I told him what I did to it before. He was angry, but he said he appreciated the honesty. Good, John said. What about the families? Whose garden you destroyed? I bought new seeds and helped them replant everything. It's going to take a while to grow back, but Dr. Price said the new plants should be stronger than the old ones. John sat down on the bench beside Margaret. And your father? Jake looked uncomfortable. That's harder. He doesn't understand why I'm doing all this. He says I'm embarrassing the family by apologizing to people. What do you think? I think maybe our family has been embarrassing itself for a long time, and I was just too selfish to notice. Over the following weeks, Jake's transformation became visible to the entire colony. He volunteered at the community center, helping elderly residents with errands and household repairs. He worked part-time at the veterinary clinic, assisting Dr. Price with animal care. He even started a program to train young people in basic life support skills. The change wasn't immediate or easy. Jake had moments of frustration, times when his old attitude surfaced. But each time, he caught himself and made the choice to be better. Other people in the colony began to notice. If Jake Morrison could change, maybe other things could change too. Danny and Pete, Jake's former friends, were among the first to be affected. Seeing Jake's genuine transformation made them question their own behavior. They started volunteering alongside Jake, at first reluctantly, but eventually with real enthusiasm. Mrs. Chun, the elderly woman whose windows Jake had broken, became one of his strongest supporters. She taught him how to cook traditional recipes and shared stories about her youth on Earth. In return, Jake helped her with technology and made sure her apartment was always in good repair. Frank Rodriguez hired Jake to work part-time at the water treatment plant, teaching him about the systems that kept the colony running. Jake proved to be a quick learner and a dedicated worker. The ripple effect spread beyond the young people. Parents began questioning the examples they were setting for their children. Business owners started treating their employees more fairly. Even the security force began investigating complaints more thoroughly instead of automatically dismissing them. Richard Morrison, Jake's father, was slow to understand what was happening. At first, he was angry and embarrassed by his son's behavior. He couldn't understand why Jake was wasting time helping people who couldn't benefit the Morrison family. But as weeks passed, Richard began to see changes in the colony that affected his business in positive ways. Worker productivity increased when people felt respected. Equipment lasted longer when it was properly maintained by people who cared about their work. The colony's reputation improved, attracting better workers and more investment. Slowly, Richard Morrison began to change too. John watched all of this with quiet satisfaction. He continued his work at the transportation depot, but he also kept an eye on Jake's progress. The boy was genuine in his efforts to change, but old habits died hard. John remained ready to intervene if necessary. One evening, as John was walking through the residential district, he encountered Jake helping an elderly man carry groceries to his apartment. "Mr. Hayes," Jake said when he saw John. He had learned John's real name after the confrontation in the tunnels. "How are you doing?" "I'm well, Jake. How are you?" Jake set down the grocery bags for a moment. "I've been thinking about something you said. About choosing to be human every day." John waited. "I used to think being human meant being on top, being stronger or richer or more important than other people. But that's not it, is it? What do you think it means?" John asked. Jake looked up at the stars visible through the dome covering the colony. "I think being human means taking care of each other, especially the people who need help the most." John smiled. "That's a good answer, Mr. Hayes." Jake hesitated. "Will you ever trust me completely?" John considered the question carefully. "Trust is earned through actions over time, Jake. You're doing the right things now, but you've only been doing them for a few weeks. Ask me again in a year." Jake nodded. "That's fair." As autumn approached, John made a decision. His work on New Terra Colony was complete. Jake Morrison had transformed from a potential terrorist into someone who actively protected the vulnerable. The colony's culture was shifting toward greater compassion and responsibility. Other keepers could monitor the situation from now on. John packed his few belongings and prepared to leave on the next transport ship. Margaret came to see him off, with Luna walking beside her. "Thank you," Margaret said simply. "For what?" "For remembering who my husband was. For remembering who we're all supposed to be." John knelt down to say goodbye to Luna. The dog licked his face and wagged her tail, seeming to understand that he was leaving. "Take care of her," John told Margaret. "We'll take care of each other," Margaret replied. "That's what humans do." As John's transport lifted off from New Terra Colony, he looked down at the settlement through the ship's window. In the plaza below, he could see Jake Morrison helping an elderly woman with her shopping while Luna walked beside them. The colony looked peaceful from up here. John knew that peace was fragile and needed constant protection. But he also knew that the people of New Terra Colony had learned something important about protecting each other. John activated his communication device and sent a message to the Keeper Network. "New Terra Colony secure. Local guardians in place. Moving to next assignment." Somewhere in the galaxy, another Keeper would receive that message and add New Terra Colony to their watch list. The formal Keeper organization might be disbanded, but the network of protectors remained active. John settled back in his seat and thought about his next destination. There were always places where innocent people needed protection. There were always bullies who needed to be reminded that power came with responsibility. There were always chances to choose what it meant to be human. Outside the ship's window, the stars waited, bright and endless, full of worlds where that choice mattered every single day. Back on New Terra Colony, Jake Morrison finished helping the elderly woman with her groceries and walked back toward the community center. Luna trotted beside him, no longer afraid of the boy who had once kicked her. As they walked, Jake thought about Commander John Hayes and the lesson he had learned in the mining tunnels. Being human wasn't about being the strongest or the richest, or the most important. Being human was about choosing, every day, to protect the innocent and care for those who needed help. Jake had made that choice today. He would make it again tomorrow. That was what it meant to be human among the stars.